several things I'm going to be covering about machining and parts in a very limited way. Now, these are pictures of the different types of tap and die formats that are used for various purposes. The bottoming type bottoming type tap is mostly used for nuts and bolts that bottom out at the bottom, obviously. The plug type is used to make literally a metal cork. You can use this as also a way to get it to feed in, and then there's tapered. These are both made to where that they're easier to thread in, that sort of thing. They don't require as much effort, and they can actually be used for another purpose. You can use this to jam fit a seal inside of a pipe. And if you haven't noticed, the picture of the taps have interrupted threads, or it could be considered an interrupted screw, even though this is for cutting threads. And there's another one like this for doing the actual screw. And this is what they do look like. Now, if they were both identical, like each of them having 4 cutting points, the surface area of how much material is cut determines how many of those holes are done for each of them. But generally, the ones that you use for putting a hole in something have 4, and that's about it. And the ones that are done for doing your the bolt itself may have, half a dozen or whatever of those holes drilled in it off to the side. The idea is to give it room for the metal chips to come out. But you may have noticed if there are 4 on each, and they were identical in size, these two are different, you could put one inside of the other and then kind of get it to thread in, and then it would be locked, at least from going forward and back. There would still be these big circular holes off to the side, but what if you made a screw where you ground off the threads and you made a nut or a socket for it to go in and ground off half the threads, 50-50, or some variation of it? You would have a locking screw that you could slide in almost all the way and then crank once. A very short amount of rotation, or maybe a quarter rotation or half. Well, it'd have to be a quarter rotation or a third. This is a breech plug. The original reasoning behind this was a necessity. Originally, when you'd build a cannon, one of the easiest ways to make a cannon that could be rifled would be you'd make a very long tube and then somehow block off the end of it, and then you'd pour your gunpowder down in there or put bags of powder in, and you have a hole drilled into the side to light a wick, or pour in flash powder and light it from there to set it off. Well, when people would need to do this with their muzzle-loading guns, rifles, cannons, sometimes they'd have to remove the breech plug. It was a plug, sometimes it was welded, and it was usually a screw-in thing. And someone got the brilliant idea, what if I cut off half the threads and make it to where I give it a half a turn, or even fewer if I put more of these nodes in, to where I can just push it in and rotate it and get it to lock in place. Of course, the first thing you're thinking of is, well, when you do that, these threads on the big bolt will line up with these threads on this big nut, but up here you have a dead space, and over here you have a dead space that's going to be there, so you're going to have a bad channel. Well, you may have noticed that this last part here protrudes into where the chamber is. This is mostly just to hold it in place. It's not to create a gas check. The gas check is formed by this, and yes, that is where a firing pin goes, right there. Now, in case you're not aware of it, that's exactly what they did. And also you can have a gas check on the outside. There's also a variation of it where this is the barrel, and this is simply put over it, and this back area is completely capped off, and that is used as the bolt in bolt action rifles in some cases. In a way, it is the same thing. It basically makes it where you can rapidly put in a big hunk of metal to make sure that there's no way for something to blow back in your face, or other, and this allows you to, well, do this quickly and crank it shut with a half turn or less. How much less? Well, it depends on what you're looking at. Let's look at some other variations of this. This is one where it's tapered in 2 sections to where the break space or open spaces are separate, and this one's a tapered plug, a lot like what you would use as a threaded cork in the end of a pipe, hence the reason for the tapered versus non-tapered images I showed for tap and die. Now, there's another variation of this that was done, but it always comes up with these problems of needing to line them up. Now, obviously, if you do these have to be 2 different diameters. You can make this stepped and have multiple diameters, like 2 diameters is considered more than enough. The other method is this one, where you have each of the threads different diameters. You make it a multi-bore thing, and again, the majority of this surface area here is actually the seal over which the barrel is sealed inside of. And again, this could also be a barrel, and this could be the thing on the outside. A quick disconnect. Stepped thread plug. This is the Welin type. In the past, muzzleloaders and old guns that loaded from the breech as well, using loose powder or paper cartridges, were used in normal hunting seasons because that was the standard. That's what they had. They were new then. And this was done during open season because, again, that's when they were invented. Later, out of necessity, and much later, you could choose to challenge of hunting with a handicap with primitive weapons. Now, this has actually got a reason for being connected to the previous part of the video. Weapons now include, for primitive hunting, currently, falconry, yes, hunting with a bird, bow and arrow, crossbows, muzzle-loading shotguns, 20 gauge or larger, rifles, 36 caliber or larger, with open peep sights and scopes, any ignition systems allowed, like flintstone, literally flintlock, percussion cap, cap and ball, electronic, disc, whatever. Shotgun primers are even used, or anything which uses black powder or black powder substitute, and it can also use pellets. These propellant charges can be a solid mass, which means they can be dropped down the barrel easier. But it cannot contain modern smokeless nitrocellulose or nitroglycerin components, or have a revolving rifle function so that you have multiple shots. The idea is it's single shot and primitive method for propellant. And you have to compress the powder when you press the bullet in if you use black powder substitute, because the air gap will create a problem, unlike modern smokeless powders. Today's special muzzle-loading only hunting season was originally legislated into existence just to make the hunting season longer, and that caused the modern inline muzzleloader to exist. It didn't use a percussion cap, it simply used a modern cap, and it was done inline instead of off to the side, so it had almost no difference between a modern inline muzzleloader and a big shotgun shell with steel walls bolted to a frame with its own trigger mechanism. Yes, that's where this comes from. Now, why would I bring up the breech loader? You notice all those breech loaders were for cannons. They're for modern military, 40-pound bags of propellant, gigantic rifles. Are breech loading and muzzle loading mutually exclusive? No, you can have part of it loaded from one end and then from the other if you want to, but there's no advantage to loading something from the muzzle, for the most part, except arrows. Yes, there is a completely new category that's been created for firing arrows using compressed air with a muzzle loading arrow that's hollow, and also ones that are not hollow. You put it down into a barrel, and it's an air rifle arrow season. Do laws specifically state that a muzzle loader has to be loaded from the muzzle? Here's an example. A rifle that is loaded from the muzzle. Or can you, that's all there is to it, right? Well, it doesn't have to have black powder. You can take a muzzle loader if it's made from a modern shotgun. You can do that. You can drill out a ream and make a breech plug. Now you have a shotgun you've converted to muzzle loader. Once you do that, you're allowed to convert that muzzle loader. It can be a double barrel, legally, or single barrel only for muzzle loader season. It can then be, because you can just stick a 209 cartridge in the ass end of it and make it into a giant shotgun shell or double barrel one, you can then legally make it, because it's a muzzle loader. In most states, muzzle loaders don't have a lower limit. They can be pistol based, which means you can have a 12 gauge pistol as long as it's muzzle loading. And then, again, if you have twist-off barrels, quick twists like I'm describing, legally speaking, is it still a muzzle loader? Are you required to use black powder? Can you pull the breech plug? Push in your modern jacketed bullet, because they're now using those legally in muzzle loaders, because it's not considered the component that makes it legally a muzzle loader. Place your 2 pellets of propellant, which act like cartridge material. Replace and close that breech, and you can make this to where it unscrews and screws in. You just have to have a handle or wrench handy to do it. It only needs to loosen it partially, and you can make it a quick pop out and quick pop in, and then have a hole through it for a 209 primer into that breech plug. Would this legally still qualify as a muzzle loader? Because some states also say that primitive hunting season, which it's just called primitive hunting season, include all of the above, and anything that only fires a single shot. You can use cartridge shotguns now, because they were used in the 50s, and this is the current year. That's now seen as primitive hunting equipment. Yeah. So, legally speaking, again, ATF rules versus state, county, city, and neighborhood rules. Are you legally permitted to own a muzzleloader that you made, and are you allowed to take a shotgun, chop it down, and make a pistol out of it? Only if you make a muzzleloader. But it depends on the rules and laws. You have to look up all these rules, and you have to do it in stages. But if you make the muzzleloader have essentially a locking bolt that locks in, and you don't have a permanently installed handle, so you have to use a tool on it. This is the tool rule, the bullet button rule. Are you in possession of an illegal weapon because it's not a muzzleloader anymore? Because you can muzzleload it. If you can muzzleload it, versus you can't do it any other way, versus what's the point again? Because some states are now just saying it just has to be, for hunting season, a single shot shotgun. You can't have multiple shots. Look up Axel Welin's breech block, Elswick Ordnance Company's coned interrupted screw breech block, and look up any modern breech loading muzzle loader designs you want. Because the word muzzle loader doesn't even require muzzle loading for all the components. It just requires one thing. I don't know if you know this, the legal definition of a muzzle loader, because you can have an air rifle muzzle loader used in some states, and the ATF actually gave somebody permission for this. And you can also use it to launch arrows or broomsticks. So you got your broomstick, is that the bullet has to load from the muzzle. Everything else can load from the back end, because there's something called a separate chamber or split chamber muzzle loader. You put the bullet down the muzzle, and you have a built-in cartridge in it, and they slam together. It's really weird. But the point I'm making here is, again, as I've said before, a muzzle loader, legally speaking, is a single-shot shell or cartridge. You have to hand load every time you want to fire it. It slows you down. It's primitive, and the idea is it's based on primitive technologies for it. But it's essentially big, long, heavy-duty, overbuilt bullet cartridge or shotgun cartridge. And now for the rest. Blasting caps. Totally unrelated. Somebody made a blasting cap sized piece of dynamite. So now it looks like a blasting cap, but it's actually the entire thing. Now here's the history of them. On the upper right, you have a fuse, like in the old days. This would be crimped onto a piece of tubing, and it would have a pyrotechnic ignition mix that can react to an explosion, that can react to heat, whatever. This could be used as a booster or a transfer charge. The top one there is actually that type. You stick the fuse in and crimp it, sometimes with your teeth, which is a bad idea and may actually make it go off. The fire hits the pyrotechnic ignition mix, which explodes, but very weakly, and this pushes on the primary explosive, hence the reason for the crimp, and then that goes to the output explosive small section that's just enough to get the rest of it going, and it's made actually as basically a little tiny, really tiny stick of dynamite, aka this is a fused copper tube or aluminum tube. Well, basically this is a gun cartridge. Yeah, we've miniaturized down our cannon to the tiniest pieces possible. Yeah, that's literally a cannon barrel with a really big open end because the fuse is almost as big as the barrel. But that explosion is what drives a dynamite stick because it has to be hit with an explosives. The next one on the right-hand side is called a solid pack electric type blasting cap. Now this one uses an insulator, an electrical fuse is used here, and has a primary explosive surrounding what's called a bridge wire. The idea with this is you run a huge amount of current and a lot of voltage through it to where it vaporizes the metal. When you take a solid or liquid and vaporize it, or turn it to a gas. It actually has to be a gas to be completely accurate. It turns into something that takes up about 1,000 times as much space cubically, meaning it's 10 times as wide, 10 times as tall, and 10 times as deep. This hits the primary explosives, sets them off, and then that sets off your gunpowder. Basically, the primary explosive is effectively a primer. Primary? Now we go over here. Fuse wire leads for a match or fuse head electric type blasting cap. This is when you see people DIYing for making model rockets work. Insulating header, and it goes to a heating element that sets off the electric match. Then that just lights on fire the pyrotechnic mix, just like the fuse did on the upper right there, and then that sets off your primary, and then that. Exploding bridge wire type. This one uses the bridge wire again, but this one uses a foil or bridge wire that's bigger, and it sets off an explosive. The slapper type uses a little gun barrel for the aluminum or piece of wire expanding, and creates a bow shockwave to set off the interior explosive, which is also a primary explosive. They're basically the same thing. And why am I bringing this up? Some brilliant person figured out how to do something. You may have noticed that each of these has 3 or 4 components in it. But that initiator explosive is literally a shotgun primer waiting to happen. So someone figured out a real simple idea. Take the entire tube and remove everything else except the output explosive and stick a shotgun primer in it. The diameter is almost identical to being a blasting cap. And you know what happens is when you do that, you end up with this overpowered, ridiculously large blasting cap. Blasting caps look like pencils. They're sometimes called pencil bombs. And it's obviously open on both ends, so it's not considered a pipe bomb. If you seal the end and make it out of cardboard and use a shotgun primer, it's a bore obstruction, ultra low basically it's a 200 gauge shotgun shell. It's a 22 caliber looking tube with a paper tube, by the way. That's basically it's a shotgun primer triggered ladyfinger firecracker, but it's used to set off explosives, right? Well, no, because it has so much output explosive, it in and of itself acts like a miniature stick of dynamite, and they just use basically an overpowered version of a primer to break rocks. This is for cement and doing work outside. Just saying. Next. Norman E. Johnson. Norman E. Johnson. Rifle Magazine. And it was April 2016. 2 bores, 1 barrel. Don't look up what that's a joke about. He goes into detail in 2016 of drilling out the nose or the muzzle of a shotgun or a rifle and making another chamber. In this case, it's a rifle. So now, is it really a muzzle loader? Or is it a breech loader? Because it has a breech/muzzle. This did not make the ATF have any nightmares, I assure you. They didn't sit there going, now the fuck are we supposed to do here? So yeah, it was done in 2016 as an experiment. And again, emphasis added. I didn't invent this, I don't think, but I came up with this idea years and years ago because I was trying to ream out literally a rifled air gun and I needed to make a chamber for it. So I just used the other end. I just stripped everything off and made it to where it was threaded. I didn't know what I was doing. I had a tap and die set and a drill press. I didn't care. But I'm not sure this is patentable, but obviously someone else thought this was a good idea, or someone else was just as crazy as I am. And in case you thought I was lying, crack wisely is the motto of a company that made those little 209 shotgun shell primer based little dinky sticks of dynamite right there. They made it to where you could ship them. They're the size of 22 caliber. Basically, you could almost, but not quite, stick that into a 25 caliber pistol, a 25 ACP, and blow your gun completely up, I guess. They were called the Micro Blaster, Power Load, and a bunch of other names. It's changed company names repeatedly because Micro Blaster ended up being the name of a toy. I just thought it was funny. I saw somebody using those to do mining, and I thought, that looks scary stupid. And yes, you could kind of get away with making a 22 caliber shotgun shell out of it, even though there actually is one. It's just a 22 caliber with rock salt in it, but that's considered a shotgun technically by the ATF. But this would be ludicrous speed, and it wouldn't move anything except the outer walls of the barrel and hurt the person. Yeah, anyway, and in this case what they do is they drill a hole in the ground. Yeah, it's a 1/4-inch hole, and then they put that down into it. After getting all the dirt out, they drill a hole into the rock, and the harder the rock the better, and then they set this off, and it acts as a concussion or high explosive charge, even though it's not high. And yeah, little tiny fake dynamite almost, but it's triggered by an impact. So they use an air compressor and a little thingy, or they might use a really, really long nail and have it, fired by something. And one of the designs actually just uses what looks like an inside-out version of a 22 caliber barrel. It's probably a 17 caliber barrel, where they just ran the firing pin all the way down the barrel, and that's used to set it off. And you put a rock on top of it to keep it in, and it creates a contained explosion. And basically, you're setting off a little cardboard pipe bomb inside of the rock. So instead of a pipe bomb, you got yourself a Flintstone pipe bomb. I'm really bored today. So anyway, thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that.